This happened to me a few years back, when I was in my early 20s. At the time, I worked in a department store, at a makeup counter. The job relies heavily on good customer service and building relationships, because you want people to keep coming back to spend money on your products. We're given personalized business cards so that we can build our own client base. Very important for a commission department. It's not uncommon to be familiar with people who frequently shop in the store. As workers, our training is focused on being friendly and accommodating. One day while I was working, I had to move to a makeup counter that wasn't my own to cover someone's lunch break. It was a really slow day, so I was just leaning on the counter, people watching. I could tell most shoppers were just browsing, so I kept to myself. One of the people that I noticed was a very tall and broad man. He walked very slowly, almost hunched over. His face was fixed very aggressively, like he was angry but focused. He circled around the counter a few times, but I could feel his gaze resting on me instead of the products. After a few rotations around the department, I decided to greet him in case he needed some help. It wasn't until he came directly over to me that I realized just how big the man actually was. I'm a 4'10", 140-pound female, so I always feel pretty small regardless. But even with this man's slouched posture, he was well over 6 feet tall, and well over twice my weight. I'll never forget his teeth. They were completely black in the front. Your eyes couldn't help but go right to them. Despite this menacing appearance, he was quite soft-spoken. Truthfully, I could tell he wasn't all there by the way he talked. He told me no when I asked if he needed help, but he requested my number. So direct. We had never even spoken before. I declined and said that I was in a relationship and that it would be inappropriate. He then asked if he could have a business card for the counter, in case he wanted to get some products later. Since I wasn't on my normal counter and I really wanted him to just go away, I handed him my coworker's business card and told him to call if he had any questions. It worked, and he walked away right after that, filling me with a bit of relief. Only a couple of minutes later, though, the phone on the counter starts to ring. I answered with my peppy customer service voice and say, "Thank you for calling. How can I help you?" Immediately, I know it's the same guy when he starts talking. He asked me again for my personal number, and I explain once again that I cannot do that. He just wants to talk, he explains. Since he wasn't getting the hint, I say, "I should have told you that I'm married. You can't have my number." Politely, he apologizes and then hangs up. I thought that would be the end of him, but for the next few weeks or so, I spent much of my time at work anxious that he would show up. I would see him every week, and he would lurk around the counter just looking for me. Anytime I would see him, I'd immediately drop what I was doing to run and hide or run to the closest customer and offer any bit of assistance to make it look like I was busy so he couldn't talk to me. I successfully managed to dodge him every time, and it came to the point where I stopped seeing him finally. I was thrilled. I had almost completely forgotten about him, until one day I decided to go to Walmart by myself to pick up a few things on my day off. I generally like to shop alone. I can take all the time I need, and I like leisurely looking around. I grabbed a basket and made my way over to the cosmetic and wellness section, since that's where most of the things I needed were. I only managed to grab a few things before I locked eyes with him as I walked by the supplement aisle. I had recently changed my hair color and wasn't wearing my work uniform, so I didn't think he'd realize who I was. I was ready to just go about my shopping and ignore him, until I noticed that he'd dropped all the items he'd had in his hands and started running my way. I panicked and swiftened my pace immediately. I thought to myself, he's not really going to follow you through the whole store, right? But as I turned around to look, I could see his humongous body just plowing through people, with that same terrifying look on his face, only a bit meaner. His black teeth growing closer with a snarl. Since the direction I was walking was the opposite of the exit, there was no way in hell I was going to turn around. I decided that my best course of action would be to follow the perimeter of the store and cut down the center section, which would bring me close to the registers. I speed walked the entire time in hopes of losing him amongst all the people, but never once turning around again. By the time I'd made it to the register area, I could actually feel his presence behind me. Still not wanting to turn around to look, I glanced in the reflection of the soda machines that were in between us and the register aisles, just to see how close he was. To my horror, there were only about 1.5 to 2 feet between us. I was afraid to just drop my things and run out the door, in case he decided to follow me to my car. I had parked in the far back of the parking lot, and I didn't want to risk it. I also didn't want to get in line at the registers, since the lines were long and I would just be standing out in the open alone. Instead, I walked into the cluster of people crowded around the self-checkout line. I noticed another large but older gentleman with his carriage in the middle, and ran straight for him. The people were so closely clustered together that the man following me couldn't make it through. I ran over to the man in the line, grabbed onto his carriage and said, "I'm so sorry. I'm not cutting in front of you, but there's a man that's been following me through half the store, and I'd like to stand with you." He was so sweet, and let me be with him while we waited in line. He even let me go ahead of him so I could leave quicker. As I was cashing out, I could see in my peripheral vision my stalker staring at me and pacing about, but he couldn't come near me since the self-checkout is somewhat sectioned off. By the time I had finished and grabbed my receipt, I couldn't see him anywhere anymore. I looked around, but he was nowhere to be found. I thought about asking the older man to walk me to my car, but he still hadn't finished at his register, so I decided to call my boyfriend and make a run for it. Staying on the phone, I explained to him what was going on as I sprinted to my car in tears, frantically looking around in case he tried to follow me outside. I made it to my car safely and rushed right home, breaking down to my parents about what had just happened. I could feel it in my bones that that man wanted to do something to me, and thankfully I didn't find out what that was. His aggressive aura was palpable. To this day, I can still remember the adrenaline, nervousness, and the sheer terror I felt when he followed me. I've never felt so vulnerable and helpless, even with all of those people around. I quit that job roughly 2 years later. I had only seen him one other time there since the incident, but I live in constant fear that we'll cross paths again someday. I'm afraid to shop alone, something that I wouldn't give a second thought to years before. I posted this story earlier today on Entitled Parents, and have had a few suggest I post it here as well. I hope you enjoy. So I have a friend who's just recently been getting into these entitled parents stories. We eventually started talking about them, and would laugh at the sheer stupidity of Darwin's failed experiments, until last week. She began to be more and more quiet, and when I finally pressed her, she revealed that she's been coming across some of the stories of attempted kidnapping, and they reminded her of a night many years ago. She never made a Reddit account, so she asked me if I could post her story. After telling me what happened, we're both still not sure if this fits or not, but it's a story that if someone would ever find themselves in a similar situation, they might get some ideas to protect themselves, maybe. So without further ado, many moons ago, in the early 2000s, my friend Sarah was going to the local state college. Now, while the college was in the city, she lived out in the country with her father and would use the bus system to go to and from school. One afternoon after class, Her and her friends went to one of their apartments to study for some exams. Well, being the young and responsible young adults that they were, they studied for maybe 10 minutes before things turned to a more festive gathering. After a few hours, Sarah happened to glance at the clock, which caused her mind to snap. What time does the last bus run? Screaming profanities and prayers for warding off her demise by her father, she quickly ran to the bus stop just in time to catch its final trip of the night. With a huge sigh of relief, she flopped down into a seat in the back and threw her headphones on. Lost in thoughts of what elaborate tales to tell her father, she hadn't noticed a little boy walking up to her until she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye as he sat down right beside her. She somehow managed to not recoil at the sight of the child, because while the child was completely filthy and reminded her of someone from Deliverance, it was his creepy smile that she remembered the most. He just sat there smiling at her until she slowly slid her headphones down and the following interaction began. "Hello? Hello. You're pretty. Well, thank you. What's your name?" Now, Sarah had this policy of never giving any personal info to strangers, but kids were pretty harmless in her opinion. Every alarm was going off in her head, though. "Katie. That's a nice name." Then the kid just sat there, smiling at her. After a few minutes of smiling, the kid finally said, "You would make a great mom." He hopped down and walked back to an even more dirty and unkempt monster of a man, who she could only assume was the boy's father. Just like his son, he was smiling at her. When she looked at him, he nodded politely and kept smiling. She put her headphones back on and dug out a book to pretend to study, but she kept looking back and noticed both of them smiling and staring right at her. As each stop came and went, she prayed they would get off the bus, but as the bus began to empty of other passengers, she soon found it was just her, some middle-aged woman, and those two. The bus was beginning to slow for its next stop in a small town that had a series of restaurants. She couldn't take them anymore, and decided that it was safer for her to go to the McDonald's and wait for her father than to sit on that bus any longer. She gathered her things and prepared to disembark. As she allowed the woman to pass, she noticed the men gathering their things. Oh hell no, she thought, but she didn't want to make it out like she was trying to avoid them, so she moved to the seat near the front and sat back down. To her horror, she watched as the man and his son took another seat and sat back down, still smiling at her and nodding. Her anxiety was going through the roof at this point, as she'd watch more stops come and go until her stop was coming up. What was she going to do? Her mind raced. As the bus came to her stop, she gathered her things again and watched in horror as the men gathered theirs. Instead of getting off, she sat back down behind the driver. How much further until the end of the line? 3 more stops. Sarah leaned in and told the driver about the man and his son, and asked if it was possible to have the police there when they arrived. The driver looked into the mirror and told her he'd take care of it. Sarah glanced back, and her heart jumped into her throat, as while the little boy was still smiling at her, the father wasn't. She described it as the look a parent gives their child when they've done something wrong, and wait until we get home. Sarah was usually a very strong individual, but she was in tears as she took out her phone and tried to call her father. It went immediately to voicemail. Who else could she call? She finally decided to call her ex. He may have been disloyal, but she could always rely on him when it counted the most. Quietly as she could, she poured her heart out about what was happening and asked if he could meet them at the last stop. Finally, they came over the hill to where the final stop was. Frantically, she looked for something, anything that could help her, but there was nothing. Finally, the bus pulled in and the doors swung open. The man glared down at her, waiting for her to get off first. Hold up, miss. I need to talk to you about your bus pass. The man stood there for a moment until the driver told him this was the last stop, and he needed to get off. "I'm waiting for my..." "Sir, you need to get off. If you're waiting for her, she'll be along shortly, but you need to get off right now." Angrily, the man stomped off with his child in tow. As soon as they got off, the driver shut the door. The man began yelling and banging on the door, and Sarah was scared he was going to break the glass until she noticed 2 police cars pulling in, followed shortly by the piece of crap Jack drove. The police ordered the man away, and she couldn't hear what was being said. Jack later revealed that the man was claiming that Sarah was his daughter, and he was taking her home. Once Jack asked him for her name, he said Katie, and that was all she wrote. In the end, the man got into a fight with Jack and the officers, but was finally arrested. When she got home and told her father what happened, he tossed her the keys to his old '82 Ram, and she never rode the bus again. It was loud and a pain to drive, but she never felt safer. She did ride the bus one final time after that, to deliver a plate of cookies to the driver who saved her life. A bit of a preface here. I was around 10 to 11 years old when this happened. Old enough to stay home alone, but not old enough to recognize some red flags. I attended camp over the summer, the typical 8 to 3 routine. My house sits close to the end of my street, which forms a U, but for some reason the bus driver would never just drop me off at my house. I would always get dropped off at the end of my street, where I would toddle myself along back home. Both my parents worked late hours, sometimes not getting home until 8 p.m., and it would be very expensive to hire a babysitter for 4 to 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. So, starting in 6th grade, when the bus dropped me off at home, I would be all by myself. I'd do the usual middle school routine, play games online and watch TV. Occasionally, my neighbor's cat would come into my backyard, and I would feed and pet her as a way to get outside. The only computer in the house was in my dad's workroom, which has a window overlooking the deck and a window overlooking the side of the house. We have large bay windows in the living room, dining room, and kitchen of my house, and since we sit on a hill, you can pretty much see the entire backyard from a nice vantage point. Most days when I got home, I'd toss off my backpack and go right to that room. You could see me walk from my front door and pop up by the computer from outside. Unfortunately, this would lead to something that I had forgotten about until now. When I got off the bus that day, I did as expected. I went into my dad's workroom and played some computer games. About 30 minutes into this, I could hear a faint meowing coming from the outside window. I paused the game to take a look outside, thinking maybe my neighbor's cat had wandered over once again. But there was nothing. I just sat back down and resumed playing, only to hear the meowing once again. It was quiet, but still noticeable, and so I checked the other window. Nothing again. This routine happened for a good 10 minutes. Eventually I got frustrated and went into the living room to watch TV. Not even 2 minutes later, meowing started coming from the window I was sitting right beside. Now I was confused and more than a little creeped out, so I shut the blinds tight and kept trying to watch TV. The meows continued, but only when they came from the window right behind me did I jump and leave the living room, officially skeeved. I went into my bathroom where the blinds were down, but still cracked a little for some sunlight. I tried to read a book, only to hear a meow come from outside my bedroom window. This was enough for me to call my dad, concerned that maybe the cat was hurt, but I couldn't see it to be sure. He said he would have the neighbor come check it out right away, and call me back later. 10 minutes go by, and I get a call from my dad saying that he was coming home from work. Nothing urgent in his voice, just that his job had gotten cancelled for the day and he would come home early. I thought nothing of it. When he got home, I realized that the cat noises had stopped. Fast forward to the present, and I asked my dad about that strange incident, thinking it was funny because the cat had followed me around. What he told me next made my blood run cold. After I'd called him, my neighbor did indeed come to check on the house. What he found were large footprints, leading in circles all around the house, clustered close to the walls so that even if I looked outside, I wouldn't be able to see anything. Someone had been stalking me through my house, seeing where I was through the large windows, and making cat noises to try and get me to come outside. They must have known I was home alone, since it was easy to see me walk by myself down the street and let myself in. My neighbor immediately called my dad and searched the whole property, but he found no one. The police weren't called since there was nothing but footprints that led off into the woods and got lost, and I never saw anyone. My dad stayed home with me for the rest of the week. It sickens me to know that there are people who would use these tactics to try and lure kids from their homes, and from there do whatever they wanted with them. So this was something that happened in my freshman year of college. Being new to a campus that I didn't have many friends on, I began seeking out some cool people to hang out with, as I had long breaks between my classes. I quickly found myself spending time with a large group of girls from my math class. We began spending time in the lounge area of my campus, and made some friends through there too. To give an idea, it was a relatively smaller campus with only a few buildings, and the lounge area was quite a small room with some pool tables and seats. As the semester went on, we began making it a regular ordeal to all go to lunch or coffee at least once a week. Our lunch group quickly went from 5 people to nearly 20. Friends started bringing acquaintances, and so our group grew once again. One kid named Spencer, who was a friend's friend, joined us regularly for coffee or lunch. One day, word got back to me that he was into me and wanted to get my number. I nicely told my friend that I wasn't interested, and that I had a boyfriend already, which was a lie. I thought this would deter him, as he came off as a non-confrontational person. One morning, a group message was sent out by my friend Trish, who asked if we all wanted to meet up for coffee, and everyone, for the most part, agreed to meet. I arrived about 10 minutes early to almost everything, so I was used to being the first one there. Spencer arrived shortly after me. He sat down next to me, and I exchanged a friendly "good morning" and a smile. Slowly, the time passed, and no one else showed up. We sat there awkwardly for about 15 minutes, when finally he spoke up and said, "This is a surprise date. I planned it." I think it's important to mention I'm pretty hot-headed, and I definitely don't like being lied to. I got up from the chair, gathered my things, and left without a word. The next couple of weeks went by without a word from Spencer. I thought maybe that he had gotten the hint that I wasn't interested. Soon, though, he began to show up at the same time that I worked out at the school gym. I didn't think much of it at first because our schedules were pretty similar, so, like myself, I assumed that this was just the only time he had to work out. Soon it went from being there at the same time to him following me around the gym. Whatever machine I was using, he would conveniently be at the one right next to me, lifting some light weights and staring. I had some friends that worked at the front desk of the gym, so I mentioned it to them and they said they'd take care of it if it got too out of hand. One day, while I was squatting at the gym, mid-rep, he walked up and pulled my headphones out and proceeded to tell me that my form was off while grabbing my waist. I racked my bar and turned around angrily, yelling at him, "Don't you dare fucking touch me." He apologized and proceeded to ask me out once again. I told him I wasn't interested and had a boyfriend anyways. Once again, a couple of weeks went by, and the only contact I had with Spencer was sitting at the opposite end of the table during our lunch gatherings. I thought he had finally gotten the hint. Then one day at the gym, as I was walking down the hallway to the girls' locker room, he walked up behind me and put both hands on either side of the wall behind my head. He said, "I know you feel the connection I do, so why don't you let me take you out?" I quickly yelled for my friend Chris, who worked at the gym's front desk. Keep in mind, he's very large, about 6'3", and extremely fit, whereas Spencer is 5'7" and, well, not. Chris quickly walked around the corner to see what was happening, and came running down the hall yelling at Spencer. He was then banned from the gym and not allowed back in. One night I get a text message from a random number, stating that it's Spencer and that he wanted to apologize for what happened at the gym. I told him that what he had done wasn't okay, and that I wasn't interested in him and that I'd like for him to leave me alone from now on. He apologized again and again. I didn't hear anything else. Thinking that was the last time, I blocked his number. All was well, until one day I came home from work to a bouquet of white lilies sitting on my doorstep. Thinking they were from my grandma, who likes to do stuff like this, I got excited and picked them up and took them inside. Then I read the letter attached. It was unsigned and just said, "I love watching you." I frantically started calling and texting friends, thinking this was some sick joke as they all knew about how creepy Spencer had been. I got concerned answers and honest no's from every single person. I panicked and threw the flowers out and made sure to lock my door. Later that night, I got a text from a random number. "You didn't enjoy your flowers? I saw you throw them away." At this point, I had had enough. I called the number, and the familiar voice of Spencer was on the other line. I lost my shit, quite literally. I didn't even let him get past his sickening hello before I started screaming at him. He then calmly stated that if I wanted to talk to him, that all I had to do was come outside. I looked out my window, and there he was, standing in front of my house and smiling. I called the cops, and when they showed up, they detained him and got a restraining order placed on him. The cops then contacted me a couple of days later to let me know he had more than one order placed for the same behavior, 10, including mine to be exact. I had late classes that semester after this, and I called campus police to walk me to my car every night because I was terrified he would show up again. Shortly after that, I moved about 300 miles away, and luckily I've never seen him again, other than his every so often random Instagram follow requests.